Someone planted the tree you are standing under right now. They are not here anymore, but what they planted is. And every time you have stood in its shade, every time you have reached up and taken its fruit without thinking twice about it, you have been living inside a decision someone else made decades before you arrived. That is what a perennial plant actually is, not a gardening choice. A statement about time. Most of us were taught to garden the way we were taught to live. One season at a time. Replant in spring. Start over in fall. Keep pace with the calendar, and never fall too far behind. It is an exhausting rhythm, and somewhere along the way, many of us stopped asking whether it was the only rhythm available. It is not. There is a kind of gardening that works on a completely different clock, where the work you do this year is still feeding someone 30 years from now. Where the roots go deeper each season, quietly, invisibly, building something that the surface of the ground will never fully show you. Where the harvest does not belong only to the person who planted, it belongs to whoever comes next. You may be at a point in your life where you think about next more than you used to, where the question of what you leave behind has moved from the distant future into something more immediate, more personal, more honest. Where you find yourself looking at the yard outside your window and wondering whether it could hold something more permanent than what is there now. This video was made for that moment. We are going to talk about the plants that ask the least and give the longest. The ones your grandparents would have known by name and your grandchildren will inherit without realizing it. The ones that, once established, do not demand your constant attention but reward your occasional presence with something that compounds quietly over years. We will cover what these plants actually contain, what the research honestly says about their nutritional value, and what it means, practically and personally, to begin a garden that is measured not in seasons, but in decades. There is nothing rushed about this conversation, and there is nothing complicated about what it asks of you. But before we begin, I want you to sit with one thought. The person who planted the tree you sheltered under today never saw you standing there. They did not know your name. They may have been gone before you were even born. And yet, in the only way that really counts, they were still there with you. What if you could do that for someone? Chapter 1. The difference between a garden and a legacy. Most people have never stopped to ask why some gardens disappear the moment someone stops tending them, while others seem to outlast everyone who ever worked in them. The answer has very little to do with effort. It has almost everything to do with what was planted in the first place. There is a category of plants that most home gardeners never seriously consider, not because they are difficult to find or complicated to grow, but simply because the way we think about gardening has been shaped almost entirely by the annual cycle. Spring arrives, we plant. Fall comes, we clear. The following spring, we begin again. It is a rhythm that feels productive, even purposeful. But it is also a rhythm that starts from zero every single year, and that fact carries a cost that most of us quietly absorb without examining it too closely. Perennial food plants operate on a completely different principle. You put them in the ground once, in the first year, or sometimes the second, very little happens above the surface. The plant is doing its real work below, extending its root system, establishing itself, building the infrastructure for everything that comes later. Then, gradually, it begins to produce. And once it does not stop. Not for a season, not for a few years, for decades, sometimes for longer than a human lifetime. This is not a minor distinction. It changes the entire relationship between the gardener and the garden. Many of us, at this stage of life, find that the relationship we want with a garden is different from the one we had 20 or 30 years ago. The physical stamina for intensive digging and replanting is not always what it once was. The interest in keeping pace with a demanding seasonal schedule may have softened. And something else has changed too. Something that is harder to name but that many people recognize when they hear it spoken aloud. We are thinking differently about time, about what things last, about whether the work we put into something will outlive the energy we put into it. Perennial food plants are, in a very real sense, an answer to that shift. Let us take a moment to consider what it actually means to plant something that will still be producing fruit when your grandchildren are older than you are right now. It is not a sentimental idea. It is a practical one. The elderberry you plant this fall may be feeding someone in 30 years. The pawpaw you put in the corner of your yard may still be carrying fruit when the person who inherits your home has no idea where it came from. The mulberry that takes root this spring may grow into the tree that shades a summer afternoon for someone you have never met. That is a different kind of gardening, and it produces a different kind of satisfaction. The plants we are going to discuss in this conversation were chosen carefully. Not for maximum yield numbers, not for the most dramatic productivity claims, but for the combination of genuine nutritional value, realistic ease of care for someone in their 50s, 60s, or 70s, and the kind of quiet, long-term presence that makes a garden feel like more than a project. We will begin with elderberry, because it is one of the most accessible entry points into perennial food production, and because what it offers goes considerably deeper than most people realize. Chapter 2. Elderberry, the first perennial worth knowing. There is a plant that has been used in traditional medicine across Europe, North America, and Asia for thousands of years, that begins producing in just 2 to 3 years after planting, and that most people in the United States could grow in their backyard right now without any specialized knowledge. It is the elderberry, and its story is worth telling carefully. The elderberry shrub, known botanically as Sambucus nigra in the European species and Sambucus canadensis in the American native variety, has been documented in historical records going back to ancient Egypt. Medieval European herbalists considered it one of the most useful plants available. Native American communities used both the fruit and the flowers for a range of traditional purposes. In Scandinavia, elderberry has been woven into food culture for so long that entire festivals are organized around the harvest of its flowers in early summer. None of this is coincidence. Plants that appear repeatedly across unrelated cultures, across centuries of recorded observation, tend to do so for reasons that genuine attention eventually confirms. Modern nutritional research has found that elderberries contain a class of compounds called anthocyanins, which are the pigments responsible for the deep purple color of the ripe fruit. Anthocyanins are of considerable interest to researchers studying oxidative stress in the body. Without making specific health claims, it is accurate to say that elderberry is among the most anthocyanin-dense fruits that can be realistically grown in a temperate climate. The berries also contain meaningful amounts of vitamin C and a range of flavonoids, which are plant compounds that researchers have observed in the context of immune function and inflammation. The research is ongoing and appropriately cautious in its conclusions, but the direction of the findings is consistent enough to explain why elderberry has attracted serious scientific attention in recent years. You may have noticed elderberry syrups and extracts appearing in health food stores and pharmacies over the last decade. That is not purely a marketing trend. It reflects a genuine increase in peer-reviewed interest in what this plant actually contains. From a practical standpoint, elderberry is one of the most forgiving perennial shrubs you can choose. It tolerates a wide range of soil conditions. It is adaptable to most of the continental United States, thriving in zones 3 through 9. It grows quickly, reaching its full height of 8 to 12 feet within a few years. It responds well to pruning and can be shaped to fit a specific space. And in a productive year, a mature elderberry shrub can yield an impressive amount of dark small berries in late summer. The processing step is worth mentioning clearly. Raw elderberries should not be eaten in quantity. They contain small amounts of a compound that can cause digestive discomfort when uncooked. But briefly heated, whether into syrup, jam, juice, or baked into muffins or pies, they are completely safe and genuinely delicious. The syrup preparation in particular is simple and practical. Berries simmered with water, a touch of honey, and whatever spices appeal to you produce a rich, deeply colored syrup that stores well and serves a variety of uses. The flowers, which appear in early summer before the berries, are also edible. Elderflower cordial, made by steeping the fresh flower clusters in sugar syrup with a little lemon, is a traditional European preparation that has seen a genuine revival in recent years. It is light, fragrant, and unmistakably of a particular season. If you have ever tasted it, you remember it. For someone beginning with perennial food plants, elderberry is often the right first choice. It produces relatively quickly, it responds visibly to basic care, and it gives you a reason to engage with the garden at 2 different points in the season. The flowers in June, the fruit in August or September. That seasonal structure is part of what makes a perennial garden feel alive in a way that a purely annual garden sometimes does not. The next plant we will consider requires more patience, but what it eventually gives back is something that very few fruits in the temperate world can match. Chapter 3. Pawpaw, the native fruit that time almost forgot. It is interesting to reflect on how certain plants simply disappear from common knowledge within a single generation. The pawpaw was a staple of the North American landscape for thousands of years. Native communities throughout the eastern half of the continent ate it fresh and dried it for winter use. Early European explorers wrote about it with genuine enthusiasm. Thomas Jefferson grew pawpaws at Monticello. Lewis and Clark recorded subsisting on them during difficult stretches of their journey. And yet, by the middle of the 20th century, most Americans had never heard of it, let alone tasted one. The reason for its disappearance is almost entirely a story about commercial distribution. Pawpaw fruit is extremely perishable. Once ripe, it holds for perhaps a week under refrigeration. It cannot be shipped across the country. It does not fit the modern grocery model. And so a fruit that had been feeding people on this continent for millennia simply stopped appearing in the food supply, and within a generation or two, faded from common awareness. This is worth knowing, because it reframes the question of why you may never have encountered it. The pawpaw is not obscure because it is inferior. It is obscure because it is inconvenient to industrialize. The fruit itself is unlike anything else that grows in a temperate climate. The flesh is custard soft, pale yellow, and intensely flavored with notes that most people describe as a combination of banana, mango, and vanilla. It is genuinely tropical in character, which makes sense because the pawpaw is the largest fruit native to North America and is the northernmost member of a plant family that is otherwise entirely tropical. One tree in a good year can carry 50 to 100 pounds of fruit. A mature grove, properly established, produces abundantly with almost no inputs. The tree grows 15 to 30 feet tall. It prefers rich, moist, well-drained soil, and does particularly well in partially shaded conditions, which makes it an excellent choice for forest garden settings, or for the shadier corners of a yard where other fruit trees might struggle. It is cold hardy to Zone 5, and some varieties push into Zone 4 with adequate protection. It has effectively no serious pest or disease problems in North America, partly because its leaves and bark contain natural compounds that most insects find unappealing. The pollination requirement is worth understanding. Pawpaw flowers are pollinated primarily by flies and beetles rather than bees, and the flowers are not particularly attractive to these insects on their own. To ensure reliable fruit production, it is strongly advisable to plant at least 2 different named varieties rather than seedlings, and some growers supplement with hand pollination during the flowering period, which takes only a few minutes and dramatically improves fruit set. From a nutritional perspective, researchers have found that pawpaw contains meaningful levels of several B vitamins, vitamin C, and a range of amino acids that compare favorably to other common fruits. It is also one of the richer sources of certain minerals, including magnesium and iron, among fresh fruits you can grow in a temperate garden. The research on pawpaw nutrition is less extensive than on some other fruits, simply because commercial interest has been limited, but what exists is genuinely interesting and supports the long-standing reputation of the fruit as a substantive food source. The pawpaw is not a plant for someone who wants to harvest fruit this autumn. The establishment period is real, and the trees can be slow to begin fruiting, sometimes taking 5 to 7 years from a grafted tree and longer from a seedling. This is where the perennial mindset matters. You are not planting for next year. You are planting for the year your grandchildren visit in late September and find something extraordinary waiting for them in the yard. What comes next has been cultivated by humans for longer than almost any other plant we will discuss today, and its story begins in a landscape far from here. Chapter 4. Mulberry and Aronia. Abundance and the honest truth about antioxidants. Some plants earn their reputation quickly, others take centuries. The mulberry belongs to the first category. It is possibly the fastest path from bare ground to genuine fruit abundance of any tree you can plant in a temperate climate. Aronia, which most Americans have only recently encountered, belongs to the second category. It has been quietly accumulating a research record for decades that is only now receiving the attention it deserves. Together, they represent 2 very different expressions of what a perennial fruit plant can offer, and they are worth understanding on their own terms. The mulberry tree, in its various species, has been cultivated by human beings for thousands of years across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. The white mulberry was the foundation of the entire silk industry in China, where its leaves fed the silkworms that produced the thread that connected trading routes across half the globe. The black mulberry was prized in ancient Persia and Greece for its fruit. The red mulberry is native to North America and was an important food source for many indigenous communities. These are not obscure botanical footnotes. These are plants that shaped human history. What makes the mulberry particularly valuable for a home perennial garden is its combination of speed, adaptability, and generosity. A young mulberry tree begins fruiting within 1 to 3 years of planting. By its 5th or 6th year, A well-sited tree can produce quantities of fruit that will genuinely require planning to use. 100 pounds or more in a productive season is not unusual for a mature specimen. The fruits ripen over an extended period in early summer, which means you are not facing a single, overwhelming harvest window, but rather several weeks of moderate, manageable abundance. The flavor of mulberries varies somewhat by species and variety. Black mulberries tend toward a richer, more complex sweetness with a slight tartness. Red mulberries are milder. White mulberries can range from sweet to nearly bland, depending on the variety. For culinary use, the darker fruited types are generally preferred for jams, pies, and juices. For fresh eating, the choice is a matter of personal preference. Researchers have noted that mulberries contain a range of anthocyanins and other polyphenolic compounds, similar in class to those found in elderberry. The ripe dark fruit in particular shows meaningful concentrations of these compounds in laboratory analysis. There is also ongoing research interest in certain compounds specific to the mulberry that are not common in other fruits. This work is at an early stage, and it would be premature to draw firm conclusions from it. But the general picture that emerges from mulberry research is consistent with what traditional users of the fruit have understood for a very long time. The practical considerations for growing mulberry are worth a candid discussion. These trees get large if unpruned, sometimes very large. They produce fruit abundantly, which means that anything parked under a mature mulberry in fruiting season will accumulate purple stains, and they are vigorous growers that can spread aggressively in some conditions through bird-distributed seeds. Choosing a named fruiting variety rather than a wild seedling gives you some control over size and fruit quality. Siting the tree away from driveways, patios, and light-colored surfaces is a practical decision you will be glad you made. Aronia, the other plant in this chapter, presents a different profile entirely. It is a native North American shrub that most people in this country have never encountered. Even though it has been commercially cultivated in Eastern Europe for its health properties for several decades, and is now appearing in serious nutritional research with increasing frequency. The berries are small, dark purple to near black, and intensely tart. Eaten fresh, they are not pleasant for most people. This is their primary liability from a commercial standpoint, and the reason they have not achieved mainstream recognition in American grocery stores. But processed into juice, syrup, or dried and added to other preparations, Aronia is a genuinely versatile ingredient with a flavor profile that pairs well with apple, grape, and a range of culinary applications. What makes Aronia notable from a research perspective is the concentration of polyphenolic compounds in the ripe fruit. Several analyses have found that Aronia compares favorably to blueberries, cranberries, and other commonly cited antioxidant-rich fruits in laboratory measurements of certain compounds. The caveat that always applies is that laboratory measurements do not directly translate into predictable clinical outcomes for any specific condition, but the consistent finding that Aronia contains very high levels of plant compounds of genuine research interest is accurate and well supported. From a growing perspective, Aronia is among the most resilient shrubs you can put in a garden. It tolerates poor soil, wet conditions, dry conditions, extreme cold, and minimal care with equal equanimity. It is reliably productive from Zone 3 through Zone 8. It grows into a rounded shrub of roughly 5 to 6 feet. The white spring flowers are attractive. The berries ripen in late summer, and the fall color is genuinely spectacular, a deep scarlet that makes it one of the more visually rewarding plants in the garden in October. If you are looking for a plant that asks almost nothing of you and delivers consistent, meaningful production year after year, Aronia belongs on that short list. There is still a plant we have not discussed that carries perhaps the most interesting intersection of scientific research and everyday practicality. It grows underground, asks almost nothing, and has been feeding people on this continent since long before European settlers arrived. Chapter 5. Jerusalem artichoke and elderflower. The overlooked pair. Not every valuable plant announces itself with impressive fruit. Some of the most useful things in a perennial garden work quietly, below the surface or in the background, and reveal their value gradually to the people who pay attention. The Jerusalem artichoke is one of the stranger plants in the North American food tradition, and that strangeness is partly what has kept it from becoming the staple it perhaps deserves to be. It is not actually an artichoke. It is not from Jerusalem. It is a type of sunflower, native to the eastern half of North America, that produces underground tubers with a flavor and texture that remind many people of water chestnuts when raw. and become nutty and creamy when cooked. Indigenous communities across eastern North America cultivated it extensively as a reliable, high-yield caloric staple. The plant is extraordinarily productive. A small patch, left to its own devices, will multiply each year, sending up tall stalks topped with cheerful yellow flowers in late summer and producing an expanding underground network of tubers that can be harvested in fall and through the winter. The yields per square foot are genuinely impressive, and the plants require essentially no inputs once established. The tuber contains a type of carbohydrate called inulin. This is the detail that makes Jerusalem artichoke of particular interest to nutritional researchers. Inulin is a prebiotic fiber, which means it serves as food for the beneficial bacteria that live in the gut rather than being digested directly by the body. Research on the gut microbiome, which is the community of microorganisms living in the digestive tract, has expanded dramatically over the past 2 decades. The consistent finding is that a diverse and well-nourished microbiome is associated with a range of positive health markers, including digestive function, immune activity, and aspects of mood and cognitive health. Prebiotic fiber from food sources, rather than supplements, is generally considered the most effective way to support this bacterial community. Jerusalem artichoke is one of the most concentrated dietary sources of inulin available in a whole food. The practical caution is worth stating clearly. For people who are not accustomed to eating high inulin foods, introducing Jerusalem artichoke gradually is a sensible approach. The fermentation that occurs when gut bacteria process inulin can cause digestive discomfort if the body is not used to it. Starting with small amounts and increasing slowly over a few weeks allows the microbiome to adjust. Many people find that after this adjustment period, the digestive response normalizes entirely. Cooking method also makes a difference. Roasted Jerusalem artichokes tend to produce less discomfort than raw preparations, partly because the cooking process breaks down some of the inulin. A gratin with olive oil and a little thyme, or a simple roast alongside other root vegetables, is a preparation that does full justice to the flavor. The one honest caution about growing Jerusalem artichoke is this. Once established, it is enthusiastic about expanding. Planting it in a contained bed, or in a corner of the garden where spreading is not a concern, is a practical decision that will serve you well in later years. It is not a plant that stays politely where you put it, but managed with a little awareness, it is one of the most reliably productive things you can have in a perennial garden. The perennial herbs deserve a brief place in this conversation as well, because they represent perhaps the most accessible entry point of all into long-lived food plants. Lovage, which is a large perennial herb with a flavor that strongly resembles celery and parsley combined, grows in a single clump that expands gently each year and can be harvested for decades. Sorrel, with its tart lemony leaves, emerges among the earliest plants in spring, when almost nothing else is ready, and can be added to soups, salads, and sauces. Horseradish, planted once, will provide a reliable harvest of its pungent root for as long as you care to maintain it, and considerably longer if you eventually stop. These are plants with centuries of culinary history behind them. They are easy to establish, undemanding in their requirements, and provide something fresh and useful from the garden at times of year when the more celebrated fruits are not yet available. What we have covered so far has been primarily practical. The final chapter asks a somewhat different kind of question. Chapter 6. What perennial plants are really asking of us? There is a moment that many gardeners describe, and it usually happens not during the active work of gardening, but in a quieter interval, standing at the edge of the yard in the early evening, or looking out the kitchen window on a morning in October when the light has changed. The moment is a kind of recognition. Something out there is older than you are. Something out there will still be here after you are gone. And something about that fact, rather than being sad, is actually deeply settling. This is not an accident or an individual quirk of temperament. There is a body of research in environmental psychology and gerontology that explores what researchers call future self-continuity, which is the degree to which a person feels connected to and invested in their own future, and also in the future beyond their own lifetime. Studies in this area have consistently found that people who maintain a sense of investment in the future, who continue to plant things, build things, and contribute to things that extend beyond their immediate circumstances, report higher levels of well-being and life satisfaction in later life. The perennial garden, quite literally, is an expression of this orientation. Planting something that will not reach full maturity for 5 or 10 years requires a particular quality of trust. It requires the belief that the future is worth investing in, that the work done now will matter to someone, that time is not running out so much as it is deepening. Many of us, you and I both know, carry a complicated relationship with time as we move through our 50s and 60s and beyond. The awareness that more is behind us than ahead can arrive as a source of anxiety, or it can arrive as a kind of clarification. The perennial garden speaks to that clarification. It says, the fact that you will not harvest all of this is not a loss. It is part of the gift. Research on purpose and longevity has found repeatedly across different populations and methodologies that a clear sense of purpose, a feeling that one's daily actions are connected to something that matters, is associated with measurably better outcomes in aging. Not in a vague inspirational sense, but in terms of concrete health markers, cognitive function, and overall quality of daily life. Purpose, it turns out, has biological effects. Tending a perennial garden is a form of purpose that is particularly well suited to later life. It is physically manageable in a way that intensive annual gardening is not. It is rhythmically predictable in a way that provides genuine psychological comfort. The same tree flowers in the same window of days each spring. The same shrub ripens in the same weeks each fall. This seasonal constancy, which a perennial garden provides in ways that an annual garden does not, has documented calming effects on the nervous system. It is a form of natural clock that anchors us to something larger than the daily news cycle or the fluctuations of any particular week. There is also the relational dimension. A perennial plant that you establish in your yard becomes, over time, part of the story of that place. It becomes something that visitors notice, that grandchildren ask about, that the next occupants of the home encounter without knowing its origin. You become part of the invisible history of a living thing. That is not nothing. In fact, for many people, it turns out to be quite a lot. The plants we have discussed in this conversation, the elderberry and the pawpaw, the mulberry and the aronia, the Jerusalem artichoke quietly spreading its underground network, the herbs that emerge faithfully each spring, are not complicated or demanding. They do not require expertise. They do not require a large property or a significant investment. They require only a willingness to begin and the patience to let time do most of the work. That patience, as it happens, is something that most people who have lived long enough to be watching a video like this one tend to have in considerable supply. The most important thing you can do today is simpler than any of the plants we have discussed. It is only this. Choose one, not 5, not 10. One plant that speaks to you from what we have covered today, whether it is the elderberry that begins producing within a few years, or the pawpaw that asks you to think in longer terms, or the aronia that asks almost nothing at all. Choose one and put it in the ground this season, because the person who plants the tree does not need to see its full canopy to have done something real. They only need to plant it. And in the year it finally reaches full height, shading some afternoon in a future you can imagine but cannot quite see, your decision to begin will be fully present in every leaf of it.